Disclaimer. Quantus tremor est futurus quando judex, et J.K. Rowling, est venturus cuncta stricte discussurus. The first thing Hermione did was look down through the machicolations to see how much damage the exploding runestones had done. To her great relief, the north wall was battered, but not breached, although the hospital wing was compromised. Both the door and the back wall were blown wide open. She'd never noticed it before, but it seemed odd that the infirmary was in a non-central location in a tower separate from the rest of the castle. In case of quarantine, maybe? McGonagall's first reaction was to grab Snape by the shoulder like an errant student, somehow still managing to look intimidating despite Snape being 8 inches taller and a Death Eater. "I assume you didn't know about this, Severus?" she said icily. "Certainly not, Minerva," he said, brushing her off. "As headmaster, I've been rather busy to stay as close to the inner circle as I have in the past." Well, now that the siege wards are broken, and we have less than 1 hour to figure out what to do about it, do we at least know the damage to the castle?" Several of the other professors were already surveying the scene. "It doesn't look very serious to the main walls, Minerva," Flitwick said. "As you can see, there is a large hole through the hospital tower, but it appears to be structurally stable." "Except that as it now stands, it is a way for Death Eaters to enter the castle," she replied. "Everyone, we will have to evacuate the infirmary to the main keep and collapse the walkway. Quickly!" Most of the defenders hurried down to the 4th floor, leaving only a handful to watch the enemy in case they made a move before the hour was up. Harry tried to stay by the parapet, but Sirius pulled him back. "You're the one he wants, Harry," he said. "We don't want to give him the chance to swoop in while we're distracted." Ginny agreed. "Go, Harry. I'll keep watch and tell you if Riddle makes a move." Harry agreed and went with the rest of the group. Meanwhile, Hermione stopped Justin and handed him her makeshift sniper rifle. "Here," she told him. "It should work close enough to the rifles you've used before. I already adjusted the scope for the bullet drop, so just aim and shoot." She handed him a handful of crude, high-caliber bullets. "I only had time to make 7 rounds, but if you can't hit Riddle in that amount of time, he probably won't give you the chance after that. But don't shoot unless he makes a move, or the hour is almost up. We don't want to give him an excuse to attack sooner." "Got it," Justin said. "I'll be ready." "Thanks, Justin." She hurried down to the 4th floor with the others, and they rushed into the infirmary. There weren't many patients in here yet, but they also had to move all the rest of the beds, and all of Madame Pomfrey's supplies. Hermione was just thankful there were no bulky machines to move, and no wires or tubes connected to the patients. That was the nice thing about magical healing. If you survived at all, you rarely needed any complicated equipment. The hard part was where to move everything. Most of the West Wing was residential, and they couldn't very well set up in the corridors. The Great Hall was too exposed, and the Room of Requirement was over in the East Wing. "The Hufflepuff Common Room is probably the best option," said Professor Sprout. "It's farther to carry the injured, but it's near to the kitchens, and it's one of the most reinforced parts of the castle." "I suppose you're right, Pomona," McGonagall agreed. "Can you hold the door open?" "Certainly." With levitation charms, it didn't take too long to get the whole infirmary moved to the basement. A wall of barrels had opened to reveal a warm, earthy-looking room. There were potted plants and comfy-looking chairs all around, and the doors to the bedrooms were perfectly circular, so that for a moment Hermione was certain she'd stepped into a hobbit hole. It was only half underground, but it was the best option. The professors immediately set about walling up the windows by the ceiling. Cedric gaped when he saw the entrance. "I didn't know the door could do that. I thought it was only the one barrel." "It's an emergency feature in case we need to evacuate quickly," Sprout said. "Although it was expected that we'd be evacuating out." That made Hermione wonder about the other dorms. Gryffindor also had an entrance you had to pretty much crawl through. In any case, they soon got Madame Pomfrey set up again, and McGonagall summoned a couple of suits of armor to guard the entrance. It wasn't much, but every little bit would help. Meanwhile, Harry was sent down to check on Professor Babbling again. over his protests, so he would be out of sight when the attack came. When they reached the grand staircase, Hermione stopped. Something had seemed a bit off about those suits of armor, and it finally clicked. "Professor McGonagall!" she called. "That spell to animate the statues, does it affect the top of the Great Tower?" McGonagall stopped and looked up, her eyes rising up to the hidden upper floors of the grand staircase. "You mean above the nominal top of the castle? No, I don't believe it does." "Can you redirect it? Get it to bounce up there?" "Get it to... No, I don't have any way to do that, Miss Granger. Do you?" Hermione put Ravenclaw's diadem back on her head and closed her eyes. Soon she laughed, it was so simple. "I think so, ma'am. Ron, I need your help." Ron was there at once. "What's going on?" "I think I know a way to get more suits of armor to defend the castle," she explained. "In theory, the interior of the Great Tower goes up forever, but the wards truncate at the 15th floor because the founders didn't have the right arithmetic techniques, or any arithmetic techniques for that matter, and the wards patch it over with copies of other parts of the castle." "What? Oh, so there are more statues up there?" Ron said. "Exactly." She pulled a notebook from her handbag and started scribbling. "We just need to introduce a small focusing element to the wards to bend them over the gap." It wasn't a direct modification to the wards, just the runic equivalent of a lens, and a weak one at that. A fifth year could do it, given time, but translating it to runes was tricky. She applied the Greek numerals Bill had taught her to produce the correct formula and showed it to Ron. "It doesn't have to last very long, just long enough to recast the spell, and it'll flood the tower with enough magical energy to start the process." Ron examined her drawings. "Yeah, I can work with this," he said. "Come up with something quick. What do you think, Professor?" McGonagall looked over the drawing. "I'd prefer to check with Professor Babbling, but if it's only going to be active a short time, we'll need to do it presently. If this is right, it will briefly leave the outer walls of the tower unprotected." "For a few seconds, yes," Hermione admitted, but she doubted Riddle would have the time to react, even if he did notice. With Ron's help, they were done in a few minutes, and McGonagall stood just outside the center and cast the spell again. "Per totem locomotor!" A blinding white column of light shot straight up the center of the grand staircase and shook the great tower to its rafters. A distant clanking sound came from far above, even as the new runes burnt out, and the light vanished. They had done their work, and the castle now had that many more defenders. They climbed back up to the battlements, and by the time they reached the 7th floor again, the first suits of armor were already passing them, marching down the other way. Ron stopped and stared, and even McGonagall gave them a bit of a pause. The suits of armor were different now. Distorted. These were imperfect copies created by the mathematically undefined singularity in the wards. Some had extra arms, making them even more effective. Some were missing a limb, or literally had 2 left feet, or had limbs bent at impossible angles. The ones in the front were the most accurate, but when she looked to the higher levels of the staircase, Hermione saw even the most distorted ones still shuffling forward like Monty Python's Black Knight. A couple looked like they were made of bronze, and one at the limit of her vision had a torch for a forearm instead of a gauntlet, but they could still be useful. "Not long left, Minerva," Hestia Jones reported when they came back out onto the ramparts. "I hope we're ready." "As ready as we can be, Hestia," McGonagall replied. "Actually," Hermione said, "there's one more thing I'd like to try. Now that the shield is down, does anyone here besides Hagrid know how to get to the centaurs?" "Eh? What's wrong with me?" said Hagrid. "Sorry, Hagrid, but a broom won't support your weight." "We can do it," Fred and George said in unison. "I can probably get there quickest, though," Sirius jumped in. "I doubt you'll convince them to fight, though." "That would be nice, but that's not what I need, Sirius." He frowned. "What do you need, then?" Hermione turned to her old roommates. "Lavender, Parvati, you two speak astrology," she told them more quietly. "I want one of you to go with Sirius and ask the centaurs if any of them were born on New Year's Eve of 1926. Remember that. New Year's Eve, 1926. You have an astrology question? Lavender teased. Hermione groaned and pinched the bridge of her nose. This is not the time, Lavender. Relax, I'm kidding. But what's it for? She said. Just trust me when I say it's important. Circle around behind the castle to stay out of the line of fire. Can you do it? Lavender hesitated, glancing at Sirius, but she answered, Yes, I'll do it. They didn't waste any time. The two of them mounted a broom, disillusioned, and took off to the south, flying low. McGonagall gave Hermione a queer look, but was interrupted by Katie Bell saying, Professor, Angelina and I were talking, and we were thinking, with the shield down, some of us could sneak to the broom shed and grab some more brooms, or at least keep the Death Eaters from getting them. McGonagall waved her off in annoyance. Very well, Miss Bell, if you think you can do it. Thanks, Professor, Katie said, and she and Angelina ran off. 1 minute, Hestia called. Everyone stopped and knelt down to hide fully behind the parpet, only peeking out through the crenellations. Justin took his position, prone behind one of the slits, looking out through the scope of his sniper rifle at Riddle. A tense silence fell over the castle. Crack! Everyone jumped. Justin had fired the sniper rifle. The rifle was silenced, of course, but the bullet, traveling 3 times the speed of sound, wasn't. For a split second, Hermione let herself hope, but then she heard Justin mutter, Damn it! A moment later, another crack sounded. At the same moment, a roar echoed across the grounds. Moments after that, the first curses reached the castle walls. Boom! The thunder of spellfire was louder than before. Hermione felt the ramparts shake beneath her feet, heard the parpet grind and crack as blasting curses hit it. The magic of the castle would resist a lot, but the wall wouldn't hold as long as the shield did under that kind of assault. Justin's third shot was lost in the noise, but his scream wasn't. Hermione heard the shots and turned to see Justin lying on his back. His hands were on fire with a sickly green flame. Professor Sprout tried to put them out, but it didn't work. It took the efforts of several Order members to extinguish them, and by the time they did, Justin's hands were stiff and blackened. "Oh my God, what happened?" she gasped. "Damn it, I hit him!" Justin cried, sounding half-crazed. "I hit the bastard, but it just bounced off of something and then—" He raised his hands. "A personal ward against bullets?" she said. "Who cares? He needs help," said Susan Bones. "Get him to Madame Pomfrey, quickly," ordered Professor Sprout. "The rest of you to your posts." "I'm sorry, Justin," Hermione called as they led him away. Their posts, under the circumstances, were mostly just crouching behind the parpet and firing curses down at the attackers below. As before, the plants presented an impediment to the Death Eaters, and the sheer number of Death Eaters meant they couldn't properly dodge them like before. Of course, that also meant many of them got through. The castle was strong even against a superior foe, but some of them would still get through. It was a head-on assault, straightforward, but Riddle still had surprises up his sleeve. "Heads up!" someone screamed. Hermione looked up and barely had time to get a shield charm up before the rock that was larger than a basketball and must have weighed more than she did, crashed into it and knocked her to the ground. Another rock caved in the chest of a student who wasn't fast enough, a dozen or so yards away. A small tree trunk with its point sharpened like a javelin splintered against the wall, spraying wood chips over the defenders. The giants. Unable to use magic or scale the wall, they were big, but thankfully not that big, they were leveraging their great strength by throwing things with the power and accuracy of any catapult. By an unspoken consent, about half the defenders turned their wands on the giants, throwing a hail of curses at them. The giants flinched and backed away to find cover, but it was like throwing so many pebbles at them for all the damage they did. They were just too magic resistant. Far to the northwest, the Quidditch stands burst into flames, spreading with supernatural speed. Hermione gasped, wondering if Katie, Angelina, and the others were all right, but she couldn't worry about them now. She had more pressing concerns. The distraction of the giants had given the rest of the Death Eaters more opportunity to regroup. Their initial charge had actually been beaten back, but they were pressing forward again in a slowly advancing line. Some of them shielded curses from above, and others dispelled traps and destroyed plants below, clearing the field as they went, and a few still bombarded the castle walls. A creeping aura of cold and despair was growing on the east side of the keep. The Dementors were moving, and little would stand in their way. They glided over the ground, so they couldn't reach them on the battlements, but such a large congregation would have a crippling effect as they pressed against the castle walls. Another distraction. A handful of Patronuses stopped them in their tracks, but they would require constant concentration by their casters. The Acromantulas also were not deterred by the traps, not enough for them to hold back anyway. They swarmed in even greater numbers than before, pouring around to the west side of the keep. They crawled up the walls, stabbing their pointed feet in through the broken windows. Luckily, none of the windows in the west wing were large enough for them to crawl through, except in the great hall. Hermione was about to bring up that point, only to see that Ron had beat her to it, explaining hurriedly to Professor McGonagall. She smiled a little. Ron would definitely be the authority on anything spider-related. McGonagall did something that would send more of the statues to the Great Hall. Wizards or giants would be an uphill battle for animated stone and metal, but spiders they could handle. Finally, there were the flyers. The Death Eaters had surprisingly few brooms in the air, and as far as she could tell, Riddle himself was hanging back, letting his army wear them down before attacking himself. Just as well. Granted, it was a bit difficult to fly with the giants throwing rocks everywhere, but there were some, and they swooped down on the castle from above the rest of the battle. That was dangerous, because they could rain down killing curses from above at fairly close range, but luckily at the moment, half a dozen flyers zoomed up from the broom shed with wands blazing. Katie and Angelina were back. Two of their group swooped low and dropped a dozen more brooms on the battlements. McGonagall and the other teachers began raising arches of stone over the battlements to block curses from the air, while the dogfight raged overhead. In retrospect, defending from the 7th floor might have been a superior option. The parts of the castle that weren't stone were taking a beating, the turrets and the roof of the hospital wing, but that wouldn't be an easy way in for the main bulk of the enemy.
"Miss Granger, perhaps it would be better if you were to go below with Mr. Potter," McGonagall said. "I'm waiting on Sirius and Lavender, Professor," she replied, and she kept casting curses through the crenellations, doing her small part to slow the enemy down. It took some time, but Sirius and Lavender finally got back from their mission, coming up from the south side. They looked shaken. "Bloody hell, that was close!"
"You made it?" Hermione said eagerly.
"We made it," Sirius groaned. "Wasn't easy, and the centaurs were as confusing as ever, but we made it."
"None of the centaurs were born on New Year's Eve of 1926, Hermione," Lavender said with annoyance. "I hope that answer was worth it." She nodded. "Thank you, Lavender. That's all I needed." At that, McGonagall pulled her aside with a suspicious look on her face.
"Miss Granger," she said, "I don't understand what you mean by these investigations. My first thought, I hope, was wrong, and it doesn't appear to match your actions. But if you are planning some sort of human sacrifice of someone born on that day—"
Hermione gaped for a moment.
"What? No!"
She cast a privacy spell around them, but she lowered her voice all the same.
"Professor, I didn't explain about the ritual because I can't risk Riddle getting wind of it. But the truth is, it will place a curse on the day, not him. The ritual is indiscriminate. It will kill every magical being and beast in the British Isles that was born on that day, instantly."
McGonagall's eyes widened in horror.
"Of course. That's why I was so interested in the birth dates," she said. "To make sure no one else was at risk."
Hermione nodded.
"But, Miss Granger, that is still extremely dangerous. What if there's an immigrant or someone who isn't on the records who was born on the same day?" "I've made the risk as low as I can," Hermione said. "I'd put it at 1 in 10 or less. It's a risk I'm willing to take in the face of this."
She waved her arm at the battlefield. And there were risks, to be sure, though less than if it were a more recent date. If there were a unicorn born on that day, it would be disastrous, for example, but unicorns didn't live that long. McGonagall sighed.
"Very well. Then you probably should get below."
Hermione considered and decided it was for the best. She was running out of tricks, so she could only be of so much help to the battle proper at this point.
"Yes, ma'am,"
she said. This time she did take a broom, now that they had a few spares. Descending the staircase, she found herself in the 7th floor gallery. It wasn't pretty. Some of the windows were blown out, the floor was shaking, and dust fell from the ceiling. She jumped out of the way as a curse blew through a window, probably not even aimed at her, and exploded against the opposite wall. She ran, darting from window to window, making sure the coast was clear as much as she could before passing each one. Twice more she had to dodge curses. Passing to the west side, she jumped as she heard the thump and shriek of the acromantulas trying to get through windows that were too small for them. She ran faster. She didn't like flying a broom indoors, so she didn't up to that point, but going up and down the more than 300 feet to the anchor stones on foot was more trouble than it was worth. Besides, the statues were still marching down the stairs. Uncoordinated statues that now rarely had the correct limbs. She mounted the broom and dropped down to the bottom of the grand staircase. At the ground floor, she peered into the entrance hall and immediately regretted it. The place was awash in broken statues and blue acromantula blood. She hoped that most of the spiders had learnt their lesson and backed off, but one of the monsters leapt at her from the shadows whilst screaming, "Yes, real meat!" A shambling something stumbled past her, its speed bellying its malformed structure. It was more like a modern art sculpture than a suit of armor. The thing had 7 limbs, only 3 of which she could identify, given how the form was completely divorced from material. A suit of armor's arm used as a leg, a table leg used as an arm, and a section of a chandelier that appeared to be both. It leapt upon the acromantula, stabbing at it, and 2 similar monstrosities followed, driving it away. Hermione didn't waste any time after that. Heart-pounding, she dropped to the basement, then through the door that led to the crystal cave deep beneath the castle. The light of the anchor stones, carved in pure, glowing quartz, lit up the chamber. At the bottom, Professor Babbling and half a dozen students were chiseling the runes of her ritual into the Ankh's floor. Harry stood by with his arms crossed, impatient. "Professor!" she called. Several wands were raised up at her, but were lowered when they saw who it was. "How are the preparations going?" she asked as she dismounted. Professor Babbling stood up with difficulty. She looked unnaturally tired, and her hand looked blackened like Dumbledore's had been when he was cursed by the gaunt ring. It was almost certainly a different mechanism, though, if it was a wand-based curse. She gave Hermione an annoyed sigh and said, "We're more than half done, Miss Granger, but there's still a ways to go. This work isn't easy, and it takes time to carve runes to precision, especially without blowing ourselves up with something this dangerous." Of course, she would have read enough of Hermione's documentation to understand what the ritual did. She flexed her injured hand stiffly. "And it's getting hard for me to handle the chisel. Any prospects on getting to a hospital without getting killed?" Hermione shrugged awkwardly. "If you go disillusioned by broom, maybe, but there are a lot more flyers in the air now." Babbling shook her head, seemingly to herself. "And if I cross the outer wards, I'll trip the caterwauling charm. Maybe they'd ignore it." "Professor, if your life is in danger—" "Less danger than all of our lives will be if we don't finish this tonight," she cut her off. "Just don't let those bastards in." The thunder continued overhead with an especially loud boom, but it was too far above to really shake the foundations. Hermione let her go and turned to Harry. He winced at the sound of the explosion. She could only hope Ginny was all right. "How are you doing?" she asked him. "Wishing I could do more," he said. "I'm sorry, so am I." She looked around and saw a pile of rubble along one wall. "What's that?" "That was the way to the boathouse. We collapsed it so no one could get in that way." She nodded. Good thinking. "Miss Granger," Babbling spoke up again, "who did you plan on actually casting this ritual?" That was the question, wasn't it? The number of people needed to cast the ritual was one of the most difficult questions. There were multiple numbers thematically appropriate to use, ranging from 3 to 12. She eventually settled on the classic pentagram with 5 casters, but she wasn't certain she could find that many people who could cast it cold. "Me and Harry, for sure," she started. "And Ginny," Harry added. "If I'm going to take the risk, there's no reason for her not to." "Okay, and Anthony, I suppose. Anthony," she called. Anthony Goldstein rose from where he was helping with the carving.
You want me to help with this crazy thing?" he said with a sigh. "All right, I can do it."
"Good. Thank you, Anthony. And, Professor, can you read Hebrew?"
Babbling took a deep breath.
"Well enough to get through the ritual?"
That was 5, then. Hermione had deliberately not mentioned George. He wasn't completely out of the loop, but he wasn't as deep in it as Harry, and, more to the point, she didn't want to risk his life if she didn't have to. Also, his Hebrew was non-existent. With that settled, Hermione began inspecting the runes. She put Ravenclaw's diadem back on to look it over and make sure everything was correct. It took time, but they couldn't risk any mistakes. Luckily, these were 7th year Ancient Runes students, and they were using good inscription practices, first marking the runes in chalk, and then having a second person check them over before carving them. She was most of the way through when Harry grabbed her shoulder. She tried to slap him away, but he grabbed her all harder, and she spun and saw deep worry on his face.
"They're in the castle," he said.
Hermione gave the broom to Harry and sat behind him as he flew at terrifying speeds up to the 7th floor. She heard screams and shouted curses coming from the North Tower, and saw students, teachers, and Order members pouring into it when they arrived there, pursued by Death Eaters, though not as many as she expected. They jumped off the broom and started dueling while McGonagall ushered people out of the North Corridor through a narrow archway into the North Tower that Hermione was certain hadn't been there before. Some of the Death Eaters sprinted through before she could stop them, but they were outnumbered and quickly cut down. When all of their own people were through, McGonagall waved her wand, and a stone door slid down into place like a portcullis.
"What's going on, Professor?" Hermione asked. "We had to abandon the north face," McGonagall said. "The Death Eaters got through to the base of the castle and blasted a hole large enough to get in. We couldn't hold them off in that section." "But won't they just do that to the other faces?" she protested. "Up the sheer rock faces on those sides? They'll at least have a harder time of it. When the keep was built, it was known that the north face would be the easiest to attack, and the interior defenses were designed around that principle."
That archway! It must be possible to seal off the castle into 8 sections for the 4 sides and 4 towers, and presumably on the entrances to the many staircases too, walling it off floor by floor and section by section. It made perfect sense, considering that when you stripped it down to the central square keep, Hogwarts Castle was designed to be a defensible medieval fortress.
"We must be prepared to defend the castle from all sides," Flitwick said, "especially from above. Certainly some will get in."
Meaning they would be forced down as well as back, she thought.
"We need at least 2 more hours to finish the ritual," Hermione said. "Then we'll have to make sure it holds that long," Neville called out.
The North Tower was still exposed to bombardment from the battlefield, and that meant it probably wouldn't hold for long by itself. They began backing into the West Corridor, and indeed the curses weren't coming from across the field anymore. They were coming from above, with Death Eaters running along the battlements and trying to smash through the ceiling. There were yet more spider legs smashing through the windows, and 2 Death Eaters swung down and slipped inside through them.
"Avada Kedavra! Sophie!"
Sophie Roper fell. The Death Eater who killed her died before he could kill anyone else. Who knew how many more bodies littered the castle already? Curses began smashing into the west wall, striking at a shallow angle. Hermione ran to the window and ducked as a curse sailed through it. Death Eaters were casting from the windows of the North Tower. They'd already broken through, at least on the upper floors. The defenders rushed to the windows and threw blasting curses back at them. A hole opened in the ceiling, and acromantulas crawled through it, clinging to the ceiling before flipping over and dropping to the floor. The first one inside was killed quickly. The second leapt and sank its fangs into a student before it was blasted away. 2 more Death Eaters leapt down through the hole into the midst of the group. This was becoming untenable. They'd have to retreat to the 6th floor before long. Hermione could only hope the rest of the defenders were doing better. Luna really hoped the others were doing better. She and a number of other defenders were engaged in a running duel in the East Corridor, and the Death Eaters were forcing them back fast because they couldn't put their full strength into it. The Dementors were still following them, gliding over the rocks as easily as level ground below them, pressing against the castle walls and distracting them from the fight. She was out of practice, not badly, but she hadn't done much magic since she was kidnapped. Her father was even more out of practice, or rather, he had never been a fighter in the first place. Yet here they were, fighting a murderous horde of Death Eaters side by side. She was glad the castle was able to be sealed off into different sections. It was great for slowing the Death Eaters down, but Luna had serious doubts they could hold out until dawn, like Hermione said.
"We should barricade Ravenclaw Tower," Michael Connor said. "We can mount a better resistance from there."
That was a good idea, Luna thought. Gryffindor Tower had too much exposure to the bombardment from the north to hole up there, but they could set up a very strong barrier to the Death Eaters' advances in Ravenclaw Tower.
"Crucio! Reducto! Expecto Patronum! Avada Kedavra! Hemorrhagia! Protego!"
Of course, they weren't at that point yet. Despite the deadly spellfire flashing back and forth between the two sides, and people hiding behind every pillar and alcove, they weren't forced back to the tower just yet, and they needed to buy as much time as possible. Also, despite the distraction of the Dementors, the defenders had some distinct advantages. They were boxed in a relatively narrow space, with the Death Eaters forced to filter in a few at a time through the small gaps available to them, so they were better off than they could be for being so outnumbered. Also, many of Luna's fellow Ravenclaws were not shy about using the questionable spells that Amicus Carrow had taught them all year. Still, she thought as she saw one of the Hufflepuffs fall to a blinding curse and her own roommate, Melanie, bleeding out, they couldn't hold the line forever.
"Descindo! Reducto! Take that, you ruffians!"
Augustus Longbottom cried as she cut down 2 Death Eaters at once. Luna smiled at her. She could tell where Neville got it from. His gran was one of the fiercest duelists in the castle, or so it seemed. She'd been separated from her grandson, and that only seemed to make her fight harder. Unfortunately, luck was not on her side. Rodolphus Lestrange stalked forward, ready to finish the job he'd started 16 years ago, and with a string of dark curses, he smashed through Augusta's shield and cut her down. Luna wasn't even aware of lowering her wand and nearly dropping it, or Michael Connor jumping in front of her to protect her from Rodolphus's next curse and barely getting away with his own life. She barely registered Dad pulling her away from the fight where it was safer, but she did react, tearing away from him and lashing out at the Death Eater. Even Luna herself wasn't sure what happened next. It might have been accidental magic, despite being channeled through a wand. The normally stoic girl was filled with such rage that she couldn't articulate a proper spell. She thought she might have managed to conjure a convincing imitation of an ungubular slash-kilter. Whatever it was, the next thing she knew, Rodolphus was lying on the floor, bloody, her classmates were staring at her in awe and a little fear, and she suddenly felt very lightheaded. She'd got revenge, perhaps, but the only thing she could think of as Dad pulled her away was,
"What am I going to tell Neville?"
Tonks looked to the kitchen door as the ceiling shook and dust continued to fall from overhead. The explosions in the castle above were growing steadily louder and closer. The fighting was in the castle and had been for a while. The younger kids huddled in their seats at the long tables, some of them holding each other, staying quiet through the battle. The house elves were trying to comfort them, but most of them looked scared out of their wits themselves. How much longer would it take to set up the ritual? An hour? She only had a vague idea of Hermione's master plan and how difficult it would be to execute. At this point, she was afraid it might be too late when the time came. Tonks had been furious when she first woke up in the kitchens. She was going to kill Harry and Ginny when she got out of here. But when she saw the frightened faces of the children, who had faced months of oppression and torture already, she changed her tune. Her own mum had been right. Being a mother changed your perspective. She cursed herself that she'd been blinded by her obsession with Remus before, leaving a month-old baby alone with her mum. It was too late to back out, but she saw now that Harry had foisted upon her perhaps the most important job in the castle, keeping all these children safe. It was a burden that fell squarely on her shoulders. Tonks was the only adult witch in the room who was really capable of fighting, and she didn't like those odds. Safer here indeed. She looked around at her allies. Bertha Jorkins sat rocking her son. Marvolo Crouch, she'd said his name was. Tonks snorted. If they survived this night, you could hardly find a worse name for a baby. In any case, you just had to look at her to know that Bertha was not well. Long-term Imperious exposure had a serious impact on the psyche, and from what she'd heard, Barty's father had done a number on her with his memory charm before that. There were a few older students, and members of that Dumbledore's Army group, but they were a motley crew. Zacharias Smith was a 7th year and technically competent, but he was also a rank coward, or Susan Bones wouldn't have sent him down here in the first place.
More of an asset than a risk in a real fight, was what Hermione had asked for, and Smith didn't qualify. Astoria Greengrass? Competent and willing, but she looked like a stiff wind would blow her over. Some kind of blood curse, from what Tonks could gather. Georgina Vector was only a 4th year. The house elves would die for the kids, and there were a lot of them, but being only 3 feet tall and wandless was a distinct disadvantage. An especially loud explosion rocked the castle, rattling the support beams on the ceiling, and the students squeaked in fear. Tonks could only estimate where the fighting was, but it was too close for comfort. She waved over some of the older students and the head elf to talk.
"Listen," she said. "I don't like the sounds of things up there. I think we'll have to start evacuating before long."
Zacharias Smith nodded vigorously, but Astoria Greengrass wasn't so sure.
"That's probably a good idea, but where can we go? The whole grounds are crawling with Death Eaters and worse." "McGonagall said to go through the drainage tunnels and scatter," Tonks said. "It could work. We'll come out below the level of the Death Eaters trying to get into the castle so they won't see us." "But there's nowhere to go. If we want to get away from the fight, we'll at least have to cross the river, and the lake shore along the east wing isn't that much more forgiving than here."
Of course, Slytherin girl. She'd know the terrain really well.
"We'll just have to make do, then," she replied. "Do you remember the tale of the 3 brothers?"
The students slowly smiled, and Tonks smiled back.
"Magic can solve it, as long as you're smart about it and not arrogant or short-sighted. Make a bridge. Then, with cover of night, color-changing charms, quieting charms, things the younger kids can cast. It won't be perfect cover, but it should be good enough. And besides, you know who wants the castle and Harry more than the kids. You think you can do it?"
The older students began nodding their heads. It wasn't a great plan, maybe, but it was the best they could manage. "If it means getting out of here, I'm in," Smith said unashamedly. Typical.
"All right, listen up," Tonks called to the Kitchens. "We're going to start moving you out. It's going to be tricky, but we can do it. You'll be safer if you're not all trapped in here. I want all 1st years to pair up with someone 4th year or up. 2nd and 3rd years fit in wherever you can. Here's what we're going to do."
Harry and Ginny weren't sure how long it had been, fighting off the constant stream of Death Eaters. They'd fought hard for every bit of ground they gave up, and made it slow going for the enemy, but they were running out of space. They'd been forced down to the 2nd floor, with most of the floors above them trashed, and they were pretty close to having their backs up against the Great Tower. The Great Tower itself was defensible, but if any Death Eaters got inside, it would be an impossible running battle up and down the grand staircase. Crash! Ah! Ginny and Harry both jumped when a huge fist smashed through a window, grabbed Elphias Dodge, and yanked him out of the castle. Ribbons of flesh were left on the jagged edges of the hole, and they could tell there was no way anybody would be able to get to him. Hermione ran to the window and jabbed her wand, shouting, "Commotio Cordis!" The force of the spell knocked her back a couple of steps, and when it hit the giant, it gave a bellow like an elephant and fell off the wall with a thunderous crash, losing its footing on the steep rocks. Hermione took just a moment to look.
"I don't think I stopped his heart, but he should think twice about climbing back up," she said.
Some of the other Order members rushed to the window to deal with the giant. Luckily, it wasn't easy for them to get a footing in this part of the castle. Many of the Order cast rather darker curses to handle the giants, but Snape was the one who had no reason to hold back. Avada Kedavra! The one fatal disadvantage of using creatures as huge and powerful as giants? They were bigger targets.
Of course, that also meant Snape had revealed himself in a way that the other Death Eaters couldn't possibly ignore. Fully half of them turned their wands on the traitor before them, with the rest covering them. The Order got a few good shots of their own in while they were distracted, but Harry could tell Snape didn't even have a chance. He didn't even try to shield, too many killing curses in the air, and instead dodged as much as he could and focused on the giants, managing to take down 2 more before he was cornered. At the last moment, Snape turned to look at Harry with an unreadable expression on his face before the green light hit him from behind. Even between the two of them, Harry and Ginny didn't know how many people they'd lost so far. They'd seen Kevin Entwistle fall for sure, and they didn't know if Professor Grubblyplink was still alive, and more. It was only getting harder the closer they got to ground level, with more avenues of attack opening from the sides. In theory, the inner courtyard would be vulnerable too, a shortcut to the south corridor. But to get through it, the Death Eaters would have to bash through 2 more walls as strong as the north wall they'd already breached, so it was faster to fight their way through the corridors. Crabbe and Goyle, fathers and sons, formed a wall of muscle that was advancing on Ron and Percy. Harry ran to back them up, but some thing beat him to it. Something that was probably supposed to be a statue raced forward, crawling on the ground and weaving between the combatants like a giant centipede. Harry wasn't sure what it was at first, a nearly amorphous mass of wood chips, stones, broken glass, twisted lumps of metal, bits of fluff, and more all grinding together. When it approached the attackers, it reached out pseudopods of its bulk that slashed at them, and which reformed in seconds when they were blasted away. The Death Eaters recoiled from it. Crabbe fell, stabbed through the chest, followed by his father. The Goyles had a bit more sense and backed off, but Percy and Fred were still on them. Harry was then distracted by Lucius Malfoy stepping to the front of the group, fending off curses from all sides. His eyes met Harry's, and he spoke in a cold voice. "You'll pay for killing my son, Potter. The Dark Lord wants you for himself, but I can still kill your—" Harry didn't let him finish. The moment he saw Malfoy raising his wand at Ginny, he jumped in front of her and started slashing back with a hail of curses at top speed.
"Kinda defeats the purpose when we're connected like this," Ginny thought to him even as she covered him with shield charms.
"Not now, Ginny." Harry dodged a killing curse, rolled, and snapped off a Commotio Cordis. To his own surprise, his aim was true. The curse blinked through Malfoy's shield and struck him square in the chest. Malfoy went down, but Harry didn't take the chance that one of the other Death Eaters would be able to revive him. He threw all his effort into his next spell and shouted, "Bombarda!" The hex caved in Malfoy's chest, and he went still. Hermione saw Lucius go down. Harry certainly had no reservations about killing at this point. But then, neither did she. They still needed more time, or at least she assumed they did. They ought to receive a message when the ritual was ready. They ought to be getting close. How much longer would it be? 15 minutes? 30? The Death Eaters probably meant to corner them in the back of the keep, she thought, or drive them out through the boathouse. At least, she guessed the rank and file thought that. Riddle knew about the drainage tunnels under the school, and he probably knew that the younger children were still in there. Horcrux aside, did he mean to capture the children from them and so acquire the ultimate leverage? Did he simply mean to capture the castle and deny those who escaped the last stronghold, the last safe place in Britain? And what of the Horcrux itself? He could well have visited the Room of Requirement by now and found it gone, what with the East Wing emptied. Had he checked on the others? Did he know he was mortal now? Hermione hoped he thought he had at least one left, the cup, which would not have appeared to be harmed by her spell, although perhaps it would be better if he had reason to hold back. The trouble was, what if he looked for the diadem and found it gone? He might well slaughter the entire castle in a blind rage. He'd be ruling over a heap of ash if he did that, with every child in the country from 11 to 18 dead, but Riddle didn't seem particularly sane to her at this point. It was a question she had no good answer to. And now a lot of the inner circle Death Eaters were on the front lines, and the casualties were continuing to mount. She threw out spell after spell, trying to take them down. Parvati was dueling McNair on one side. Dean was fighting Mulciber on another. There was a shriek, and a spray of blood struck Hermione's face as some Death Eater landed a curse on Professor Sprout that cut her throat. Hermione choked back a gasp and tried to stay focused while Neville ran to help her. She doubted he could do anything. Dolohov was plowing forward to the front line, coming straight for her. "Hermione!" George yelled as he tried to reach her. She heard a sickening crack, and Ron went down with a broken leg. Dolohov turned aside from her and advanced on Ron instead with a wicked grin. "No, you don't, bastard! Confrigo!" Seamus Finnegan jumped between Ron and Dolohov, wand blazing, and, to Hermione's surprise, he held his own pretty well. "Seamus?" Ron said in surprise. "I won't turn me back on you again, Ron," he said. "I won't be a coward this time." "Then you'll be a fool," Dolohov growled. "Avada Kedavra!" Seamus rolled, pushing Ron out of the way with him. Ron had enough momentum to get away, but Seamus was left on his back foot. He scrambled halfway to his feet and got about 2 more spells off before Dolohov's next killing curse struck true. Fred and George jumped in front of Dolohov next, flourishing their wands like expert swordsmen. Hermione moved to help them, but a hand pulled her back. It was McGonagall. "Miss Granger, go check on Professor Babbling again," she whispered urgently. "But—" "They can handle themselves," McGonagall guessed her meaning. McNair threw a knife. Parvati's shield slipped and it struck her in the chest. The wound started smoking. "Parvati!" Ron cried out. He started crawling to reach his one-time girlfriend. Hermione broke away from McGonagall and threw up a heavy shield to get close enough to her roommate to help. By the time they pulled her back through the line, though, she could tell it was too late. "Parvati! No, damn it!" Ron groaned. Padma sobbed over her sister's body, heedless of the blood trickling down her own face. "Hannah!" Hermione looked up and saw Susan Bones standing over a fallen and lifeless Hannah Abbott. She saw Stephen Cornfoot and Oliver Rivers fighting side by side. Moments later, Oliver fell. "Then 2 men will be in the field. 1 will be taken, and 1 left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill. 1 will be taken, and 1 left." The twins were still locked in battle with Dolohov. "We can't hold out like this!" she cried out, not caring who heard. "Back to the tower!" McGonagall shouted. "George! Fred!" Hermione called. She had to help them. She tried to reach them. She was stopped by a blinding flash of light. The floor shook and cracked. Someone tried to pull her back, but she shoved them off. She had to get to George. Only, when the spots faded from her eyes, she had quite the shock. Unlike their uncles, George and Fred had more than wands up their sleeves. The flash had been one of their prank products, and they must have used a dozen more in half as many seconds. Dolohov now made a very colorful corpse, and George and Fred were still standing tall. "Come on, we've got to get out of here," George said without missing a beat. He grabbed her arm and pulled her along. The defenders retreated into the great tower and tried to seal it off from the west corridor, but that was easier said than done. The Death Eaters wedged open the door and started streaming in after them. Worse yet, Hermione heard fighting off to her right. She looked and saw the other group of defenders pouring in from the south corridor, trying to stop the Death Eaters from coming in after them. They must have been pushed all the way through Ravenclaw Tower. They were cornered. After all this, Riddle wouldn't even need to attack himself. If they couldn't secure the great tower, there was no way they could complete the ritual before the Death Eaters got to the Anchor Stones. Suddenly, there was a loud hissing like shifting sand coming from above. The Death Eaters and the defenders alike looked up to see what was happening. For a moment, Hermione was back in the nightmarish maze she'd dreamt about 3 years ago. The dark, shapeless form of Shoggoth of the Elder Things bearing down on them. But there were no dread cries of "Tekeli Lee" here. This wasn't a Shoggoth. It was the final state of the twisted space and magic at the top of the great tower, animated by McGonagall's spell. Coming fast down the grand staircase was a tidal wave of dust and sand. If she had to compare it to something, she would say it was like a giant dust bunny crossed with the Blob, far larger than the individual statues. Friend and foe alike fled from its advance. When it reached the second floor, it divided into 2 sand-like blobs and pursued the now retreating Death Eaters.
It poured into the corridors, reaching tendrils across the floor to catch them by the ankles and pull them into its bulk. In moments it glided completely through the doors on both sides and slammed them behind it. Hermione leaned against the railing of the staircase where she stood, exhausted from the continuous fighting. She laughed brightly and shouted, "To Kaylee Lee, you bastards!" Then she whispered to the walls, "Thank you, Hogwarts. We might have a chance now." She thought she felt the staircase vibrate in acknowledgment.